Serena had always loved the quiet. The peaceful mornings on her farm, the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, and the soft calls of the animals. After years of serving in the Marine Corps, the farm became her sanctuary, a place where she could finally find some peace. It was a small piece of land, tucked away in a rural town, far from the noise of the city. It was everything she had dreamed of when she left the military behind. But beneath the calm, there was always a tension in the air. Serena had been through too much to ever let her guard down completely. Her time in the Marines had taught her how to survive in the most dangerous situations. As a sniper, she had learned to be patient, to think several steps ahead, and to never trust appearances. Even though she was retired now, her military training was still sharp, ingrained in her every movement, every thought. Serena's days on the farm were simple. She tended to her animals, made sure the crops were growing well, and fixed things around the house. The hard work kept her busy, and that's just how she liked it. She had no need for the distractions of the world outside. The people in the nearby town knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself. They didn't know her past. And she liked it that way. She had left her Marine life behind for a reason. She wanted to escape the violence, the constant danger, and the haunting memories of what she had done during her years of service. But some things were hard to forget. The gunshots, the long nights spent in the dark, the missions she had survived. They never truly left her. So, she kept to herself, hoping that the peace she had found on her farm would be enough to heal her. Serena's farm sat on the edge of the town, far enough from the center that she didn't have to deal with the busy streets or prying eyes. Her closest neighbor was a mile down the road, a quiet elderly couple who kept to themselves as well. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted solitude. But one evening, as Serena worked on fixing a fence near the back of her property, she felt a shift in the air. Something wasn't right. She paused, listening. The wind was still, and the usual sounds of nature seemed to have quieted. Serena's instincts kicked in. She had learned to trust that feeling, the one that told her when danger was near. She scanned the horizon but saw nothing unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Slowly, she walked back to her house, keeping her senses sharp, every step calculated. The sun was starting to set as Serena locked the doors and checked the windows. She had always been cautious, even in the quietest of times. The calm was always a little deceptive. She didn't know it yet, but that night would be anything but peaceful. Meanwhile, in the heart of town, a different kind of storm was brewing. A gang of criminals, led by a man named Rico, had been making their way through the area. They were looking to expand their territory, and the small, quiet towns were the perfect targets. Rico's gang had a reputation for intimidation and violence. They had been raiding farms, taking what they wanted, and threatening anyone who resisted. The local police had been slow to act, and Rico knew that the small farms around town would be easy pickings. The gang had heard about Serena's farm. They didn't know much about her, except that she was a woman living alone. They didn't see her as a threat. To them, she was just another farmer, a target they could easily control. They didn't know about her past. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Rico's plan was simple. They would show up at night, intimidate her, and take whatever they could. Serena's farm, with its land and resources, would be a valuable addition to their growing operation. They were used to getting what they wanted by force, and Serena seemed like the perfect target. It would be quick, easy, and profitable. That night, as Serena sat at her kitchen table, reading a book by the dim light of a lamp, she heard the sound of engines in the distance. Her instincts flared again. This time, she didn't hesitate. Serena quickly stood up, moving toward the back of the house. She grabbed the rifle she kept hidden in a closet, checking it for safety and making sure it was ready. It wasn't the first time she had to be prepared. She had lived through enough to know that sometimes, danger didn't announce itself with a warning. The headlights of the gang's vehicles slowly approached her property. Serena could see them through the cracks in the blinds. She didn't panic. Instead, she calmly made her way outside, positioning herself in the shadow of the barn. She knew her farm better than anyone. She knew the best spots to hide, the paths to take, and how to move silently in the dark. She wasn't just a farmer, she was a trained sniper, and her mind was already calculating the best way to defend herself. The gang didn't notice her at first. They were too busy making their way toward the farmhouse, thinking they had an easy job ahead of them. Serena watched them move, noting each of their positions and the way they communicated. It was clear they had no idea what they were walking into. They thought she was just another helpless woman, an easy target. But that assumption would soon prove to be their downfall. Rico led his men toward the house, giving orders to surround the property. He didn't think there was any need to be cautious. They were ready to intimidate and take what they wanted. They had done it countless times before. But Serena wasn't like the other farmers they had terrorized. She wasn't afraid. And she wasn't about to let them take her land without a fight. Serena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't afraid. She had faced far worse in her life. The calm she felt wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of experience. She had been in situations like this before, only in far more dangerous places. She had survived those moments, and she would survive this one too. As the first gang member made his way toward the front door, Serena took aim from her position in the dark. The first shot was precise, a warning shot aimed just beside him. It was enough to make them stop in their tracks. The silence that followed was heavy, the tension thick in the air. The gang members froze, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But Serena wasn't going to give them the time to figure it out. She was already moving to her next position, ready to stop them before they could get any closer. As the gang members began to scatter, trying to find cover, Serena was already several steps ahead. They were playing into her hands, making mistakes that would cost them dearly. Serena's military training kicked in, and she was ready. The game had just begun. The first shot had been a warning. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to send a message. Serena watched as the first gang member, a man in a dark hoodie, ducked behind a tree. His eyes scanned the area frantically, trying to spot the sniper. His heartbeat raced, and for the first time that night, he felt fear, something he had never experienced on his countless raids. But Serena remained calm. She had spent years learning how to control her emotions, how to be still in the face of danger. Her military training had taught her that fear was the enemy. Fear led to mistakes, and mistakes could get you killed. She had made a promise to herself when she left the Marines, she would never let fear control her again. And tonight, as she crouched behind a stack of hay bales, she was living that promise. The gang had no idea what they were up against. Serena had already taken out one of them without them even realizing it. They were confused, disoriented, and angry. They thought they were just going to intimidate a helpless woman, take what they wanted, and leave. But now, they were in the middle of a trap, and they didn't even know it. Serena knew her farm like the back of her hand. She had spent countless hours walking the land, learning every nook and cranny. Every tree, every bush, every shadow, and every piece of equipment was part of her battlefield. She had a plan, and she wasn't going to let it fail. She moved silently, keeping to the shadows, blending into the environment around her. She could hear the rustling of the leaves as the gang members searched for her, their footsteps heavy with confusion. They were starting to panic, and that was exactly what Serena wanted. Fear made people sloppy, and sloppiness made them easy targets. The gang had split up, each of them taking a different route around the farm to try and corner her. Serena watched from above, her eyes tracking their every move. She was like a predator in the wild, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She knew she had to be patient. It wasn't about rushing the job, it was about being precise. The next man was moving too quickly, his steps loud and unsteady. He was overconfident, thinking that Serena had no idea where he was. He was wrong. Serena had already marked his location, and with one swift movement, she adjusted her scope, lining up the shot. Her finger gently pressed the trigger, and the second man dropped to the ground with a thud. His leg was shot cleanly, and he let out a grunt of pain. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. The remaining gang members froze again, their eyes darting around as they tried to locate the sniper. One of them, a tall man with a scar on his cheek, raised his gun and shouted, "We know you're out there. Come out and face us." His voice cracked, and there was a tremor of fear in it that he couldn't hide. The gang had gone from confident bullies to desperate, frightened men in the span of just a few minutes. Serena's presence was like a shadow they couldn't escape, and the weight of that fear pressed down on them. Serena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. She was still, blending into the dark, waiting for them to make the next move. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees and carrying the scent of earth and grass. To Serena, it was like a symphony of nature that helped her stay calm, focused, and alert. But as the gang regrouped, Serena noticed something. Rico, the leader, was starting to get agitated. He was shouting orders to his men, but they weren't listening. His confidence had completely shattered. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to getting what he wanted, no matter how violent or ruthless the method. But this time, he was out of his depth. Serena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew she had to act quickly before Rico figured out a way to regroup. He was dangerous when cornered, and he wasn't about to give up without a fight. She had already taken down 2 of his men, and now it was time to finish this. But Serena wasn't just going to rush in. She had learned long ago that patience was the key to survival. She needed to wait for the perfect moment. The gang started moving again, but they were no longer coordinated. Each of them was on edge, looking over their shoulder and scanning the area with wild eyes. Serena smiled to herself. It was exactly what she had hoped for. They were no longer a threat, they were prey. She moved silently through the barn, careful not to make a sound. Her eyes scanned the area, taking in the positions of the remaining gang members. They had spread out too much, leaving themselves vulnerable. Serena's sniper training had taught her how to read a situation quickly, and right now, the situation was perfect. The third man was near the fence, trying to climb over it to get a better vantage point. Serena saw him, and she knew exactly what she had to do. With a quiet breath, she raised her rifle, adjusting the scope to his position. The man was too focused on his climb to notice her. His back was turned, and he was completely exposed. Serena exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, but it was a non-lethal shot. The bullet hit the man in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground with a loud grunt of pain. He was down, but he was still alive. Serena had no intention of killing any of them. This wasn't about death, it was about sending a message. She was in control, and they were nothing more than intruders on her land. Now, only Rico and 2 other gang members remained. They were starting to panic. They had lost their leader, their confidence shattered, and the farm, once a symbol of easy conquest, had become their worst nightmare. Serena moved swiftly, her movements fluid and precise. She was already positioning herself for the final confrontation. Rico, still furious, ordered his remaining men to find her, to flush her out. But Serena had already anticipated this. She had set her trap, and now it was time for the final phase. She would let them come to her. They were too reckless, too angry to be careful. It was exactly what she had been waiting for. As Rico and his men moved toward the farmhouse, Serena was ready. She had the advantage. They didn't know it yet, but they were already defeated. All they had to do now was walk into the trap she had set for them. Rico's mind raced as he ordered his remaining men to move forward, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. His gang had been outsmarted by a woman they thought was an easy target. Serena had turned the tables on them in ways they couldn't have imagined, and now they were on the defensive. They had lost control of the situation, and with every passing minute, their panic grew. Serena, on the other hand, was calm. As she watched them move, she felt a steady confidence. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pride. It was simply the quiet assurance of someone who had been in control of far worse situations. This was nothing new. She had been in tougher situations in the Marines, under more intense pressure. She had learned how to wait, how to let her enemies make the first move. Now, she would let them walk right into her trap. She had already taken out 3 of them, each one methodically, without drawing attention to herself. The shots had been perfect, non-lethal but disabling. She wasn't here to kill, she was here to teach them a lesson they would never forget. She had trained for this, and now it was time for her to put her skills to use. The remaining gang members, desperate to avoid further embarrassment, tried to regroup. They no longer moved with the same confidence they had when they first arrived. Fear had crept into their minds, and it was clear in the way they looked around, trying to spot Serena, their gazes darting to every corner, every shadow. They were stumbling, tripping over their own nerves. They knew they had underestimated her, and that realization was starting to haunt them. Rico, however, was furious. He was the leader, and in his mind, no woman, especially not one like Serena, should have had the power to turn his plan upside down. He shouted orders, his voice loud and shaky, but the men around him barely heard. They were too busy keeping an eye out for the sniper, unsure of where the next shot would come from. The gang members were no longer working as a team. They were scattered, each of them trying to find a place to hide and regroup. Serena could see it all unfolding in front of her. It was exactly what she had been waiting for. The confusion, the disorder, it was perfect. She shifted position again, her movements silent and fluid. As the gang members tried to get their bearings, she used their mistakes to her advantage. She could hear them talking to each other, their voices panicked, their words lost in the chaos. One of them, a young man with dark sunglasses, moved too far from the others, thinking he had found a safe spot behind a shed. He hadn't seen Serena, but she had seen him. She raised her rifle again, her hand steady. She was a master at this, her fingers didn't tremble. The crosshairs of her scope lined up with the young man's shoulder. She breathed in slowly, focused, and then took the shot. The bullet hit his arm, knocking the gun from his hand. He cried out in pain, dropping to the ground, clutching his shoulder. He was out of the fight, and the rest of the gang had no idea what had just happened. The remaining men froze. Serena had already moved. They had no idea where she was, and panic swept through them like a tidal wave. Rico turned around, his face twisted in frustration, as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had underestimated this woman, and now it felt like she was everywhere and nowhere all at once. She had turned his attack into a game of cat and mouse, and he wasn't sure he could win. "Find her!" Rico shouted. "Don't let her get away." But his men were already scattering, and it was clear that they were no longer following his lead. Serena had stripped them of their confidence, and without that, they were lost. She could hear their frantic footsteps, the sound of them running around the farm. One of the men tried to make his way toward the house, but he wasn't being careful. He wasn't thinking. He had no idea that Serena was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. And he did. He took a step too far into the open field, completely exposed. Serena didn't hesitate. Her rifle cracked again, and the bullet hit him in the leg. He collapsed to the ground with a howl of pain. He wasn't dead, but he was out of commission, clutching his leg and screaming for help. Serena didn't wait for him to recover. She was already thinking ahead, calculating her next move. With 3 of his men now incapacitated, Rico had lost the upper hand. The remaining 2 gang members were trying to regroup, but it was clear that they were no longer a coordinated force. Serena could feel the shift in power. She wasn't just surviving now, she was in complete control. Rico was losing his cool. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. His plans were falling apart, and the longer this went on, the more it became clear that they were losing. He wasn't used to losing. And the thought of it gnawed at him. He motioned to his 2 remaining men, a tall man with a beard and a younger one with a scar running down his cheek. "Get to the farmhouse," he ordered. "She's hiding there, I know it." But Serena had already anticipated this. She knew they would make a move toward the farmhouse. She had been expecting it. Rico wasn't thinking strategically anymore, he was acting out of desperation. She had taken out most of his crew, and now, the last 2 men were walking into her trap. She quickly moved into position, using the cover of the barn and the tall grasses that surrounded her. She could see the 2 men creeping toward the farmhouse, their eyes scanning the area, unaware that their every movement was being watched. Serena had already calculated their path and figured out where they would be most vulnerable. The first of the 2 men stepped into the open area near the porch. Serena smiled to herself. He was a little too confident, thinking he could sneak up on her. He was wrong. She steadied her rifle, aimed carefully, and with one smooth movement, fired. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back, falling to the ground with a grunt. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. The second man, the one with the scar, turned just in time to see his comrade fall. He wasn't fast enough. Before he could react, Serena had moved again, finding a new vantage point. With one final shot, she took him down. The gang was no longer a threat. As Rico watched the last of his men fall, he realized it was over. He was alone. Outgunned. Outplayed. Serena didn't move from her position. She didn't need to. She had won, and the message was clear: don't mess with her farm. Rico stood frozen in the middle of the field, his mind racing. The farm was silent now, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. His remaining men had been taken down one by one. The women, children, and the entire town thought Serena was just another quiet, unassuming farmer. She was so much more than that. The realization hit Rico hard: he was out of his depth. Every decision he'd made that night had been wrong, and the consequences were starting to sink in. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of his own failure had drained all the strength from him. His gang had been shattered, and now it was just him against a woman he had underestimated. Serena had done her job well. Her calm demeanor, coupled with her expert training, had given her the upper hand. It wasn't the first time she'd faced life-or-death situations, but this felt different. There was something about defending her own home that gave her an unshakable focus. She wasn't just defending her farm, she was sending a message that no one would dare underestimate her. Rico's thoughts shifted to survival. He was a seasoned criminal, someone who had seen violence up close more times than he could count. But the events unfolding before him were unsettling. Serena had done something none of his other victims had. She didn't panic. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She took control, and she did it effortlessly. As Rico moved cautiously, his mind fought against the panic setting in. He needed a plan. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. Every corner he turned, every step he took felt like it was leading him closer to Serena's trap. He wasn't sure where she was, but he knew she was out there watching, waiting. And he had no idea how to stop her. He pulled out his handgun, holding it tightly in his sweating palms. The gun, which had once been a tool of dominance, now felt like a burden. He couldn't help but wonder if it would be enough. Meanwhile, Serena remained calm and poised. She had watched everything unfold from her vantage point. She knew exactly where Rico was, she had heard his footsteps in the dirt, and his frantic movement had given him away. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. The tables had completely turned. He was on her land, in her world now, and the game had changed. From her position behind a pile of old farming equipment, Serena had a perfect view of Rico's every move. The tension was thick in the air. She could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven. She knew that his mind was clouded with fear, that same fear that had been absent when they first arrived, thinking they could easily take over a quiet woman's farm. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Rico was trying to find her, but it wasn't that easy. Serena wasn't just hiding. She had anticipated his next move, and she was already several steps ahead. She didn't need to chase him. She had learned that in the Marines. You didn't have to move fast to be effective, you just had to be smart. Serena scanned the area again, noting the positions of the vehicles parked near the house. She could hear the faint hum of their engines, idle and still. Rico would try to retreat or escape, but Serena wasn't going to let him get away. Her goal wasn't to let him live. No, her goal was to make sure he understood the weight of his mistake. She stood up silently, slipping into the shadows and positioning herself in a more advantageous spot. Her rifle was now in her hands, steady and ready. She could hear Rico's heavy footsteps getting closer, but she wasn't worried. His fear was his downfall, and she knew exactly when to strike. Rico moved cautiously, unaware that the very thing he feared was already closing in on him. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting from the barn to the farmhouse and back again. Every shadow looked like it might be Serena, and he couldn't decide which direction to go. Should he try to escape through the backfields? Should he head toward the vehicles? Each option seemed to get him closer to danger. Serena took a breath, steadying herself. There was no rush. She had him now, cornered, unsure of which way to turn. He was weak from fear, and that weakness had become his greatest enemy. Rico stopped and looked over his shoulder, sensing something wasn't right. He turned just in time to catch a glimpse of movement behind the barn. His heart skipped a beat. Was it her? Was this the end? It didn't matter. The moment had come. Serena's finger gently pressed the trigger. The shot rang out quiet but deadly. The bullet struck the ground inches from Rico's feet, sending a cloud of dirt into the air. The noise shattered the tension in an instant. Rico's heart raced, and he stumbled back in a panic. He looked up, expecting to see Serena's rifle aimed at him, ready to take him down. But Serena wasn't firing to kill. The message had been sent. She wasn't here to end his life. She wanted him to understand the cost of his actions. Rico froze, his hand still clutching the gun. For a moment, time stood still. He realized he was no longer the one in control. Serena had shown him who the real threat was. His hand shook as he lowered the gun. Serena's presence was a silent force, and the fear he had dismissed earlier now took root, deep and unshakable. Serena stepped out from her hiding place, walking toward him with steady, measured steps. There was no triumph in her eyes, only quiet resolve. She had done what needed to be done. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't seeking justice or recognition. She was a protector of her land, her home. Rico looked at her, his legs trembling. You're just a woman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the fear was clear in his words. Serena didn't respond right away. She simply stared at him, her eyes cold, unfazed. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her. It wouldn't be the last. Not just a woman, she said, her voice low but steady. I'm the last thing you'll see if you mess with what's mine. Rico's mind raced as he realized that there would be no escape. The power had shifted in an instant, and the gang that had thought they could take whatever they wanted had been stopped in their tracks by someone they had never even considered as a threat. Serena wasn't just protecting her land. She was teaching them a lesson, one they would never forget. She hadn't fired a single killing shot, but she had taken their pride, their confidence, and their plans. She had left them powerless, confused, and utterly defeated. Rico, his face pale, stood there for a moment, defeated. Serena's calmness and strength had completely stripped him of his bravado. He was broken. And he knew that there was no way out. He had lost. Serena, however, wasn't finished. She took a deep breath and walked over to him, her eyes never leaving his. Now, you're going to leave. And you'll never come back. Tell your people what happened here. Tell them who stopped you. Rico nodded weakly. There was no fight left in him, only shame. He turned, slowly walking back toward his men, who were still groaning on the ground, incapacitated but alive. Serena didn't watch them leave. She didn't need to. She had won, and her farm was safe once again. The sun had set, casting a soft orange glow over the farm as Serena stood alone, watching the gang retreat. Her feet were firmly planted on the ground, her posture as unyielding as the land she had fought to protect. The air felt lighter now, as if the weight of the confrontation had lifted, leaving only the silence of the evening behind. The sounds of nature returned, the gentle rustling of the trees and the distant call of birds in the twilight. The gang was gone. Rico and his men had left, nursing their injuries, their pride shattered. Serena hadn't killed any of them, but in many ways, she had delivered a far greater punishment. She had humiliated them, shown them that they had no power here. They had come to steal and intimidate, but in the end, they had learned an important lesson: Serena's farm was not to be taken lightly. She didn't want to be a hero. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. What she wanted was simple: a life of peace, away from the violence of her past. But that wasn't always possible. Some things could never be left behind. Some things followed you, no matter how far you ran. Serena had known that when she left the Marines. She had walked away from her military career to find peace on this farm, but she had also known that if anyone threatened her home, she would have to defend it. The events of that night had been a reminder of what she was capable of. And though she didn't take any pleasure in the violence, she knew that sometimes, there was no other choice. As she walked back toward the farmhouse, Serena took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She felt a sense of calm return, but it was different now. She was no longer just a woman seeking peace. She was someone who had faced danger and emerged victorious. Her hands had steadied in the face of violence, her mind clear and focused. In the quiet of the night, she realized that the farm, her sanctuary, was not just a place for rest. It was a fortress, and she would protect it with everything she had. Inside the house, the familiar scent of coffee lingered in the kitchen, and the warmth of the stove offered comfort. Serena took a moment to gather herself, looking out the window at the darkened land she had fought so fiercely to keep. She had won tonight, but the battle had reminded her of something she hadn't thought about in years: how much she had changed since her time in the military. In the Marines, Serena had been trained to be alert, always prepared for what came next. She had been part of an elite force, an invisible presence on the battlefield, trained to strike with deadly accuracy and precision. The sniper's role was a solitary one, but it was a role that required complete focus. And when Serena had left the military, she had hoped to leave all of that behind. She didn't want to be the weapon anymore. She wanted to be just Serena, the woman who worked the farm, the woman who spent her days in the quiet and peaceful world of her animals and plants. But tonight, that part of her had been forced to come back, to stand tall, to face the very thing she had hoped to avoid. She sat down at the kitchen table, resting her head in her hands for a moment. Her thoughts were calm, but there was a heaviness in her heart. She didn't like violence. She didn't like the feeling of taking a life, even if it was only through a shot that incapacitated. She hadn't killed anyone that night, but she had still carried out the same kind of precision, the same sense of duty that had driven her all those years. But in the silence that followed the raid, she realized that what had mattered most was not her past, not the training or the skills she had honed in the military. What mattered was the farm. What mattered was the land she had made her home. It wasn't the weapons or the tactics that had saved her, it was her commitment to protecting what she loved. She hadn't just fought for survival. She had fought for something greater. The night passed slowly, the full moon casting its pale light over the fields. Serena stayed awake, her mind racing but her body too tired to move. She sat by the window, watching the stars, listening to the soft sounds of the night. She had sent a message, but there was more to come. She knew the gang wouldn't be the last to try and take what she had built. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The next morning, the town began to wake up, unaware of what had happened just a few miles away. Serena hadn't told anyone about the raid. She didn't want anyone to know the details. She didn't need to be the center of attention. It wasn't important that people knew she had been a Marine, that she had taken down a gang of criminals. What mattered was that she had done what was necessary to protect her home. As she went about her morning routine, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, checking the crops, Serena felt a sense of peace settle over her. The farm was still hers. It was still her sanctuary, and no one could take that from her. The rest of the day passed quietly. Serena worked hard, as she always did, but there was something different in the air. It was as if the world around her had shifted. The farm felt safer somehow, stronger. And though she knew that danger could come again at any time, she also knew that she was ready. She had faced her fear, stood her ground, and emerged victorious. As the sun set again that evening, Serena stood on the porch, watching the colors of the sky shift from gold to purple. The world seemed still, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the peace that she had longed for. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. She didn't need their recognition or praise. She had done what was necessary. She had protected what mattered. In the distance, she saw the lights of the town, faint and small against the vastness of the land. She knew that they would never understand her completely. But she didn't need them to. She had everything she needed right here, in the place she had fought so hard to protect. And as the night grew darker and the stars filled the sky, Serena knew that she would continue to protect her land. No matter what came next, she would stand strong. She was no longer just a former Marine. She was the guardian of her farm, the protector of her peace, and that was all that mattered.